Hello everyone, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Cold Waters, the new submarine simulation game out by Killerfish Games, the developers of Atlantic Fleet and Pacific Fleet. Cold Waters is a real-time strategy game. Well, I really don't know how to classify this if I'm being honest. It's a real-time game that puts you in command of a US submarine, but it's not really a sub-sim in the traditional sense. It kind of lacks the full-on depth of a game like Silent Hunter, while also not really being a strategy game in the traditional sense, in that there's strategy involved, but it's not a traditional strategy game. It's almost a third-person sub-combat game, if we're being totally accurate. But regardless of what it is a lot of fun. There's a lot of authenticity behind it. A lot of things feel and play the way they should. The Russians use really accurate tactics to the best of my understanding of the way the Russians would operate. Russian submarines operate in packs. US submarines operate individually, which is, again, accurate. I'm curious to see how the game will implement US subs once you have a Russian campaign. Are the Americans going to still operate independently as you do in-game, or is it going to be packs of US subs? Because if it's packs, that's not really accurate. But it'll be interesting to see. Right now, the game just has a US campaign, but they're working on a Soviet campaign in which you fight out a hypothetical Third World War. With that being said, that's not the topic of this video today. So what we're doing today is we're returning back to the historical narrations, the historical topics that I've started talking about. So this is actually going to be the third video in the series. The first one was the look at the Foxtrot class. The second one was the look at the USS Narwhal itself, given that's the sub we're playing. And I decided, listen, we've done a lot in terms of discussing various classes of submarines, 2 classes. But before I get too deep into this series, because this will be kind of a longer series of videos, not just limited to this campaign probably, but before I get too far into this series of telling histories of submarines and classes and whatnot, I thought it would be useful to say, oh, wait a minute. This war in this game that you're seeing in front of you takes place in the 1980s, toward the tail end of the Cold War. But how did we get here? How did we get to the Los Angeles class? How did we get to the Narwhal class? How did the Soviets get to the boats that they're using? And so I decided it might make a lot of sense to take a step all the way back and understand how did we get here? And I think the best place to start to understand how the U.S. submarine force got to where it was is taking a look back at the end of World War II. Because right at the beginning of World War II, the United States Navy is trying to figure out, how are we going to deal with the Soviet Union? How are we going to deal with a possible conflict with the Soviet Union? And this is 1945, folks. Let's not forget that immediately at the end of World War II, Americans, especially in the military, less so in the civilian space, but definitely in the military, Americans are already trying to wrap their head around the Soviet Union. The ally in World War II that the U.S. Navy helped to supply via convoys almost the entire meat ration of the entire Soviet force during World War II. They supplied the Soviet Union with more than 30,000 trucks, more than 2,000 tanks. The trucks and the meat that they provided went a long way in allowing the Soviets to beat the Germans. With that being said, the Americans helped build this massive juggernaut up, and immediately at the end of the war, 1945, and the Navy's already trying to figure out, how do we deal with the next conflict? And again, they've already identified that potential opponent as being the Soviet Union. It's natural, right? The 2 largest kids on the block, the US and the Soviet Union, the British Empire is kind of declining. It's already pretty clear that it's shot its bolt, and that the Soviet Union, as the principal opponent of Germany during World War II, the principal giver of life, more than 20 million Russians die in World War II. In the United States, the economic juggernaut that helped facilitate the British, helped arm the Russians, helped supply the Russians, helped arm and supply the British, fought the Japanese, this massive industrial complex of the United States, pitted against the sheer determination, the willingness to take casualties, and often overlooked the tactical and capable brilliance of an experienced and effective military in the Soviet Union. And the United States is already figuring out, How do we deal with the Soviet Union? Because we know, our generals and our admirals know this ideology, this communist sort of dictatorship is not going to coexist well in a post-World War II Europe as early as 1945. And so the Navy needs to figure out how it's going to deal with that. The Cold War hasn't been announced in name, but again, the Navy's already trying to figure out what its path forward is. So to really understand the U.S. Navy, and not to get overly lectury without providing too much content, but to really understand the U.S. Navy in the Cold War, I think you need to go back and understand where was the Navy at the start of that Cold War? Where was the Navy at the very end of World War II, when the Navy's first trying to figure out how it's going to deal with the Russians? First trying to figure out what its role is in any potential future conflict with the Russians. Where was the Navy at? What was its starting point at that point in time? And that's what this episode, now that I'm 6 minutes in, a very long-winded of saying, that's what this episode will be all about. And so, 1945, World War II is over, and the United States and the Western Allies are victorious. But from a submarine perspective, because that's what this game is all about, where did the United States stand? It's often easy to forget that at the end of World War II, the Navy with the most advanced submarine force in the world was not Germany, in spite of the Type 21 class submarine, which I'll talk about in a bit. But in fact, the nation with the most advanced and modern class of submarines was the United States. The United States Fleet Boat class of submarines, or rather not the class, but the classes that made up the United States Fleet Boat submarines, was actually more advanced than any of the nations that existed in the world, their submarines, with the exception of the Type 21s of Germany, which had a whole bunch of technical and teething issues that they were working through. The United States Fleet Boats were much larger than most of the other Navy submarines. The Germans did have a couple of larger submarine class, but in general they used the Type 7 submarine. Yes, there was the longer-ranged version, but the workhorse of the German Navy was the Type 7, which is about 700 tons. The American Fleet Boat submarines were about more than double that, above the surface and even substantially larger below the surface. These were submarines that were designed to operate across the Pacific Ocean. They were designed to operate from Pearl Harbor all the way out to the Japanese coast and be able to get there and back again with substantial striking power to be able to deal Japanese shipping and naval assets a critical and decisive blow. The United States Navy during World War II had a bunch of issues. First of all, initially their submarine captains were highly ineffective initially. They were not aggressive enough. Additionally, the Americans had a serious torpedo issue that did not get resolved until 2 years into the war with basically completely worthless torpedoes for a number of reasons that we won't go into this video. Suffice to say, the sub-war for the United States did not really start until 1943. The U.S. was operating submarines in the first 2 years of its war, but it was not operating them in any way in which it was making any noticeable contributions to the war. And while the fleet boat had originally been designed for the Navy to be able to attrit Japanese capital ships, that is, battleships and carriers, so that they would attrit the Japanese Navy down to a point where U.S. dreadnoughts could engage them successfully and destroy them in a decisive fleet action, despite the fact that the Japanese capital ships were largely made impotent by the Battle of Midway before the U.S. torpedo issue was ever resolved. The American submarines did end up waging the only successful submarine campaign against merchant shipping in history. And by that I mean the only war in which the submarines truly brought the enemy to its knees, crippled its merchant marine, and enabled the United States to win without actually invading. Now, while you likely know the history behind the atomic bomb and the relentless American advance across the Pacific to Japan and then the canceled invasion of Japan, what you may not know if you're not truly into history is that the American submarine force had already brought Japan to its knees. Not to the willingness of surrendering, that's not to say that the Japanese were quite to that point, but the Japanese home islands were facing the very real likelihood of starvation. Their industries were grinding to a halt. Their economy was shattered, largely thanks to not just the bombing campaign by US B-29 bombers operating out of the out of Guam and Saipan and Tinian, but also largely by the complete annihilation of their merchant marine by the United States Submarine Force. Japan was an island nation that depended heavily on trade in order to be able to feed itself, in order to be able to feed raw materials. The entire reason that Japan went to war was due to, well, not the entire reason, but a major reason that Japan went to war was due to the U.S. embargo of supplies like oil and scrap metal and other resources that Japan simply did not have in its home islands, and so Japan needed shipping in order to feed itself. Japan needed shipping in order to bring in and feed its industry with vital raw materials. And the United States Submarine Force during World War II more or less eliminated Japan's ability to do that by early to mid-1945, so that by the time the atomic bomb was dropped, things were more or less a matter of time. It was just a question of whether you were looking at killing more people via the bombing raids that would maybe bring them to their knees quicker, or whether you were more interested in starving millions of people to death and also completely crippling Japanese industry via a submarine blockade. Either way, it was the case that the United States submarine campaign in World War II was the only effective submarine campaign in history in that it could have, by itself, decisively altered the outcome of the war. The German campaign during World War II came very close to crippling British industry and British economy, although never so close as to actually influence peace negotiations. Germany during World War II was even further away from any decisive action. In spite, periods of dramatic success, which certainly scared the British, there was never a period of time in which Germany was close, we shall say, to overwhelming the British. In spite of what you may read and hear, if you actually look at detailed scholarly research, you'll find out that Germany, while a serious threat to the British Empire, never really got close enough to where it would have actually impeded Britain's ability to survive. It may have impeded its ability to fight effectively, but it never came close enough to impede Britain's ability to survive and defend its own home isles. What all of that is incredibly long-winded of saying, which I'm very good at being long-winded, is that the United States had a large and modern submarine force at the close of World War II. It had more than 200 submarines. The classes were largely made up between two U.S. submarine classes that fit along similar design philosophies that would be called by the United States the Fleet Boat Program. Those classes were the Gato class, which was an earlier class which had a crush depth of about 300 feet, and then really the most effective U.S. boats were of the Balo and Tench class, both which were known as sort of thick-hulled submarines, which had a deeper diving depth of 400 feet. In fact, that 400 feet depth was definitely on the safe side. The U.S. boats had far greater diving abilities, as was recognized in 1969 when the U.S. fleet boat Chopper descended to a depth of more than 1,050 feet off the coast of Cuba. Now, that was not intentional. The ship had gone into an uncontrolled dive. They were unable to pull themselves out of the dive, and they kept going further and further down below, so as the depth on the boat eventually reached over 1,000 feet. It was just the tip of the boat that got that deep. It's interesting that the boats had a stronger crush depth in the torpedo room near the front of the hull, because the thought was if there was ever an accident and the sub would crash to the floor of the ocean, there were certain boats that had some retrieval gear which theoretically allowed for a rescue at deep depths, and that was made stronger in the front of the boat. The rest of the boat was still rated above 800 feet, which again, the depending on how the ship would end up going down, that's substantially deeper than its crush depth. These boats were made of high tensile steel, and every single bolt, every single rivet in the submarine was meticulously screened and checked to ensure that the submarines had the absolute highest precision and quality possible. So these boats were incredibly modern. They were very long-ranged. They could operate from the Pacific Ocean, the Eastern Pacific Ocean, all the way to the Western Pacific Ocean against Japan with multiple torpedo tubes. The boats, for example, the Tench class, had 4 diesel-electric engines, 2 electric motors. It could make a top speed of 20 knots on the surface, only 8.5 knots on the submerged side. Could dive to the 400 feet that I said. It consisted of 2 127-millimeter deck guns, had 6 torpedo tubes forward, 4 torpedo tubes aft, and could hold more than 24 torpedoes all told. The ship weighed some 1,500 tons on the surface and 2,400 tons below the surface. She was the most modern submarine that was fielded in adequate numbers to give account of itself and performed exemplary during World War II. Now, the U.S. boats were outshined by their German equivalent, so the Germans did develop a submarine that did not see substantial usage. It was the Type 21 class submarine. We will talk about that boat in another video. What we really need to talk about at the moment is the U.S. Navy at the close of World War II. So at the close of World War II, the U.S., understanding that the Soviet Union is a potential threat in the future, needs to figure out what its role is in a post-World War II era. And the Navy realized, well, wait a minute, we just defeated Japan. Japan was this massive empire, this commerce nation. In many ways, Japan was the Britain of the East. And so Germany fought World War I and World War II against a British Empire, which had a vast merchant marine, a large navy, and submarines could ideally be used to starve this country and exert a decisive influence on any potential conflict. Things were a little bit different. Well, not really at all. Things were not at all different for Britain. That was for Japan. That was the whole point. Japan, again, was an island nation. It had a large navy, had a large merchant marine, relied heavily on resources from overseas, and so it was possible for a submarine force to exert a decisive influence on a conflict with Japan. But with the defeat of Japan, with the defeat of Germany, the U.S. Navy needed to figure out, all right, what the hell are we going to do? The Soviet Union does not have a large navy with large numbers of surface vessels. We have all these submarines, but what are they going to do in any world war against the Russians? And so it's actually, again, from the book that I'm reading, The Design and Construction of U.S. and Soviet Submarines, Cold War Submarines by Polymer, which is in the description. There was a quote from a U.S. Navy official, actually it was from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, talking about World War II. He said, "In World War II, the primary task of our submarine force was the destruction of enemy shipping. The success achieved in this direction should not, however, be allowed to influence our planning for any future war. It is conceivable, for example, that we might end up against a land power whose economy does not depend on extensive seaborne commerce. This was more or less the position in which Great Britain found herself in the last war against Germany. Under these conditions, full use still may be made of the submarine as an instrument of stealth and surprise without regard to its properties as an anti-shipping weapon." And so the Navy was trying to make the argument that despite the fact that the Soviet Union did not have a large surface force, did not have a large merchant marine, despite the fact that they were the most likely enemy in any potential conflict, the U.S. could still use submarines effectively against the Russians. And so this memorandum went on to propose development of 5 specialized types of submarines. They wanted a submarine that would specialize in torpedo attack, obviously for enemy attack against enemy surface vessels. They wanted a submarine that was specialized in the use of guided missiles. Again, this could be used against shipping, but it could also be used against land targets, depending on how those missiles and technological development would progress. They also wanted a submarine that was capable of acting as a cargo or troop carrier. So if you think about it, it could act as a transporter of special forces. It could also act as a transporter of just general infantry. In reading Silent Victory by Clay Blair Jr., you'll be unsurprised to see, or maybe you will be surprised to see, that the United States Navy in 1941 and 42, perhaps the most valuable bit of work that they did early on in the war, as their torpedoes are absolutely worthless, was the evacuation of many key personnel from the Philippines, and also the supply to the Philippines of key supplies such as anti-aircraft munitions and other things that were in short supply. So the Navy was using submarines as cargo and troop carriers during World War II, especially during the earlier period where the torpedoes were ineffective, although they were unwilling to admit it, and yet it was effectively employed in that mannerism. They also wanted a reconnaissance boat and a midget submarine. The midget submarine you don't really see much of, but it's interesting if you look at the torpedo attack and guided missile attack. That's all been blended into the modern fast attack submarine. The reconnaissance bit has also been blended into the fast attack sub. You can kind of think of those as being espionage boats. So the modern fast attack sub, especially the Virginia class, but also the Los Angeles class was used for this as well, would be able to be used as a torpedo attack platform, a missile-guided platform, a cargo, or in modern days, more specifically, a special forces carrier, so that cargo troop carrier, and also in reconnaissance. The only bit of that late World War II doctrine that's been more or less abandoned has been the midget submarine. And even that's still around a little bit, because it's certainly widely speculated that a lot of espionage that occurs via midget submarines, which are remotely controlled from US submarines themselves. The narwhal actually had a capsule on the back of it, which many believe to be used to control remotely controlled vehicles, which would then go tap phone wires or do other kinds of underwater espionage. And so with this in mind, and with the understanding that the United States fleet had one of the most modern boats in existence, the General Board of the Navy proposed a new version of the fleet boat submarine, which did not yet have a lot of the innovations of the German Type 21 class, which we'll talk about in a follow-on video. But they wanted to develop a submarine at the close of World War II that would be about 2,000 tons. It would still have the 4 diesel-electric engines. It could make a max speed of 22 knots on the surface, so 2 knots faster than the Tench. It would have a 9-knot speed submerged, so about a knot faster, actually maybe more like half a knot faster than the Tench. It would have 6 torpedo tubes forward, 6 torpedo tubes aft, a total of 30 torpedoes, and 2 main deck guns. So they were basically just saying, all right, well, the fleet boats worked for us during World War II. Let's go ahead and build a larger version of the fleet boats and kind of progress with that. And if you ask, well, how does the Navy view itself in relation to the Soviets? So that'll come in a following video, as well as the explanation of how the Type 21 class of Germany had a large influence on U.S. submarine development. But that's kind of where we're at the end of World War II. That's the mindset of the Navy. That's the thought process. Those are the boats they had. That's the success they had. And so they kind of viewed things as, all right, well, nothing changes here. We can still use the boat in many different ways that can help us impact a war against a country that is not a naval power principally. We still use it against naval forces. We use it in special forces insertions. We use it in transport. We use it in reconnaissance. There's a whole lot of things we can do with it, even if there isn't a huge enemy navy to face. And the British certainly used their submarines effectively against the Germans in World War II in similar roles. What'll be interesting to see is, as we go into future videos, how the U.S. Navy reckoned the submarine was a anti-submarine tool, which is interesting. When you think about the end of World War II, both the British and the Americans thought of submarines as a vital tool in destroying enemy submarines. And yet, if you look at that, despite the fact that they destroyed more than 60 total submarines between the Japanese and the Germans, all but one of those was sunk while it was on the surface. And as technology advances, you will rapidly see how the need for a submarine to be submerged is ever declining. But that'll be a topic for another video. So the point of this video is to lay the groundwork for the U.S. Navy at the end of World War II, the mindset of the Navy, the boats that the Navy had, and understanding some of the thought process going forward into the early Cold War. In the next video, we'll talk about the Type 21 class that the Germans produced but never really effectively used. We'll talk about how that had a dramatic departure in terms of mindset within the Navy about how to design a boat. We'll talk about how the U.S. Navy decided to progress with its own submarines. What did it do with the large number, the over 200 fleet boats that it had in service at the end of World War II as a result of the Type 21? And what did it think about developing in the future, again, in response to the Type 21? In addition to that, we may touch in the next video on how the U.S. Navy viewed the Russian Navy and sort of the role of the U.S. sub against the Russian bear. But with that being said, guys, that's going to do it for this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was a little bit talky. I didn't get quite into as many details or as content as I would like. I still hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below. But with that being said, I'll go ahead and jump out. Hope you guys all have a great day. And as always, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching. And until next time, I'm out.